Hi, scholars. Looks like we had a bit of a false alarm. It turns out there was no actual zombie apocalypse. It turns out those were just some hooligans down at Fry Street. I myself got injured in the black box. You know, what happens in the black box stays in the black box, so I can't say much about that. We're right at the end of our course. We enjoyed the fantasy of what if there's a zombie apocalypse, and indeed that is one of the goals of the course, to learn how to survive the zombie apocalypse. I wanted to have a little bit of fun with it. I hope you enjoyed that part as well, but I'm actually quite serious about that. I'm interested in working on how we can survive the zombie apocalypse. Now, to break that down, we need to know about the two key terms. I already asked you, what is a zombie? And your answers were great on that. Clearly, we understand the idea of what a zombie is, and there's a lot of lore, and we've learned the history through the Haitian origins, through Romero, changes in speed, changes to television series, changes in video games. But I actually want to make it just a little bit more complicated. In other words, I want you to think about the fictional zombie versus the non-fiction zombie. Now, I think the original idea behind how do you survive the zombie apocalypse, you're thinking, you mean the non-fiction zombie. You mean actually the dead have rised, and how do we get fire started? How do we rebuild communication satellites? How do we establish a government? Okay, I understand all of that, but what about the fictional zombie? What about the fantasy of the zombie? The zombie that is always already all around us and has been since the 1930s. The zombies that we've been looking at through television, through film, through video games, in our schools, they literally are popping up everywhere now. As our readings say this week, they're even in flash mobs, going outside and trying to do things. This fantasy space, what do we do about that? And here's another thing for us to think about. I asked you the question, and the goal of our course is, how do we survive the zombie apocalypse? Well, what does it mean to survive? Well, friends, to survive means to continue to exist in spite of danger. It doesn't mean to overcome the danger. It means to find a way to live with it. What I'm asking for this paper, and have been all along, is how do we live with the fantasy zombie? The zombie stories that we have already commented on are trying to tell us about race, gender. They're trying to integrate into our understanding. They're forming their young adult novels now. They're in video games. They're in mobile phones. It's everywhere. The omnipresence of the zombie as a fantasy figure. You know, if you were worried about the zombie apocalypse, I'm here to tell you it's already taking place. Zombies are all around us. They're just in fantasy form. But that fantasy form, it has an impact. And if we want to know how to live with, how to exist with, in spite of that danger, we need to think about that seriously. We need to take it quite realistically from a communication perspective. Now, we've reflected on all of these stories about the zombie. We've been tracing it and tracking it across different films, against TV shows, video games. We've noted several things. We've noted that it's always got a racial element. It's got a gendered element. There's heteronormativity at play in the zombie. We've noted that these stories are really about the survivors. We've noted that they're not about the past or the future. They're about the present. They're metaphors for the ways that we live our lives. We need to look at what these stories represent if we're going to survive them. We need to look at these examples of popular culture and try and take these things as a metaphor for how we might live with them, how we might understand them. Here's another thing. The zombie is not only this classical cinema figure, but also is a metaphor for mindlessness. To call someone a zombie means they're operating like an automaton. So the zombie is also all around us in accepting these stories and taking them as not a big deal, as looking at these things and saying, oh, that's commonplace. The zombie is everywhere. The way to survive the fictional zombie is not to become a zombie. In other words, don't become mindless. Be active. Be a rhetorical agent, if you will, and understand what's going on with these zombie stories and understanding the way they're trying to affect us. We've been tracing these things since the 1930s. Even little kids understand the idea of a zombie figure. Plants vs. Zombies was one of the most best-selling games on mobile platforms. These things are everywhere, and they are already infecting us. They're infecting us in our understanding of these large societal structures, how we understand one another, how we relate to one another, what our views on the family are, what our views on race are. All of those things, they're a byproduct of the fascination of this popular culture zombie. That's an infection just as much as actually converting the live person to dead. So how are we going to deal with this? Well, I think we take the lessons from our stories. The first thing that all these stories try to do is build community. And when I'm talking about building community, I want to emphasize the calm part of that, the communication part of community. In other words, we need to talk about zombie stories, talk about how they're infecting us, talk about the ways that they are trying to change us, talk about the things that are at stake here, at stake. That's the only way we'll be able to deal with the zombie as a real threat, the fictional zombie, the fantasy zombie as a real threat. How do we survive it? We be mindful. We be mindful and we watch these examples and try to learn lessons from them, comment on them, be critical of them. That's exactly what we're trying to do in these final papers. So I'm excited to hear the last installment of your assessment of the zombie story. It was never a trick. We were always talking about how do we live with these fantasies of the zombie? How do we make sense of them for our world? How do we remain active and not fall into mindless automatons infected by this spread? So I'm excited to hear your responses. They'll tell us how we can build community and survive this together. Good luck out there, zombie hunters.